So I'm thrilled to have him here. I'm thrilled to have all of you here. If you need room, there's still 3 spots up here in the front, and I see 1 or 2 in the back. So, Luba, I think this has got your name right on right here. You sit right next to me. All right. So, without further ado, I want to bring up Patrick and let him speak to us. Thank you, Patrick. Oh, actually, one thing. If you have questions, please hold them so I can bring them, or somebody can bring the microphone to you, so that way everybody who's either in the other rooms or remote can hear those questions, okay? So let's make sure that we use the microphone for the questions. That was the last thing. Thank you. All right, go ahead, Patrick. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. Hello, everybody. I'm going to try to stay in here. This is not like one of those invisible dog fences that I get shocked if I do some water. Okay. Because I get hoarse if I talk for too long. So I'm going to try to go for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have the rest for questions. I gave a similar talk to this to Brett and the CEO roundtable for the, am I doing all that popping? For the chamber. And I think that went for like an hour or so, but you guys had questions throughout the entire thing.
Yeah, we kept you going.
Yeah, and so this is really a condensed version of that, but with some other things mixed in, because I've been giving some talks recently. One is to Trek. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Trek. It's the real estate council, sort of like the big real estate group in the city, and I talk to their sort of young leadership professionals every single year in their classes, because they always come and tell me, hey, can you talk about mobility? It's like, well, sure, but I'm an urban designer. I mostly deal with development and a lot of private real estate clients, but I get involved in transportation. Next thing I know, I'm on the dartboard, and so I'm now the expert on urban mobility and moving around. So, okay, can you come talk about mobility? It's like, okay. Well, let's define mobility, because I also hear many city council people, mayors, governors, everybody saying we need mobility, mobility, mobility. Well, let's talk about what that is and why, and what are the outcomes. I was talking to Brett a little bit about your guys' business, and it struck me how the work you do with businesses is very similar to the work that I do with cities and with neighborhoods. It's about understanding what's going on, seeing what the kind of data is available, what are the outcomes, and aligning those outcomes to the goals and the priorities, and then, of course, the actions that those places need to take. And sometimes they are aligned, it's just the goals are bad, and you have to change the goals. And that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about here is, are the goals of the city or of the region, are they actually performing in a way that we need cities to behave? So that's really what this is about defining mobility. And we talk about mobility as movement, but to me, what is the purpose of movement if it's without opportunity or if it adds cost? So it's really about upward mobility. How do we design cities and invest in infrastructure to maximize upward mobility, right? Because just moving around, that doesn't mean a whole lot, because you're trying to get to destinations. It's not about the movement in between that matters. It's about getting to the destinations. And we're all here in Dallas, and I love that you have meeting rooms that are named. I already started getting out of them. I tend to wander a bit. I love that you have meeting rooms that are named after neighborhoods in the city. So when I start talking about certain neighborhoods, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But here in Dallas, I know how many are born and raised here. I wasn't. I've been here for 15 years. But I've stayed here because this is a city of ambition. It's a city of capacity, but they really just don't know how to align that. I once joked, I'm pretty sure the mayor stole this line, that Dallas is like a toddler with a shotgun. It's got amazing power, but doesn't know where to aim it and ends up shooting its foot off. And so, we're fascinated by this idea of world class. Dallas has to be world class. And, we build, big things, bridges, performing arts districts, and all that. And the question is, who's that world class to, right? Is it for whom? Is it for everybody? And is the city working for everybody? At the same time, it's a city that's quite divided, and many are unaware, but it's also quite impoverished. This is a map. This came from the Washington Post, but the darkest counties here are counties where median income peaked the furthest to go in the 1960s. Dallas County is right here. Median income in Dallas County peaked in 1969. It's been going down ever since. And that wasn't always the case. In 1970, median income was the highest in Dallas and lower out in the rural areas, which are no longer rural as they've developed. And median income household was $61,000, which is about the same as the entire metro is today. What has happened over time by 1990, that flipped, and the percentages here are the percentage in poverty plus those working paycheck to paycheck, struggling according to the census. And by 2013, continue to climb, median incomes continue to fall. We break that down by city. City of Dallas, 50% are either living paycheck to paycheck or in poverty. To me, that means the city is not working for everybody. How do we make the city work? And this is a very complicated sort of chart, but I'll try to explain it the best I can so it makes sense. So on the x-axis, this is the ratio of median income in the city versus the region, right? And so on the x-axis is the percentage of the population that's either in poverty or struggling. So not doing well. And then over here, where we've got these aligned, that means people with means can live either in the city or outside the city. Meanwhile, Dallas is the red dot, places up here is the middle class left. And we have to understand what happened, why did that happen, and how do we get that back? Because when we don't have that, we have all sorts of different issues that crop up. Because if the middle class leaves, they end up taking their demand for services with them, and that is the ladder out of poverty for a lot of people. So I want to talk a little bit about livability too, and it's a word that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but I define it as the greatest percentage of the population that can meet their needs on their own. And so we've got cities like Copenhagen and Vancouver and Melbourne, Australia, and New York City, all of which were going broke at one point in time or the other the last 30, 40 years. And they realized why they were going broke is because they were building for the car. They realized we keep just building for the car and investing all this money in infrastructure and trying to move cars. They forgot to invest in people, and that cities are actually places for people, and they've all changed that, and now they're all ranked as some of the most livable cities in the world. And I like to use sort of a frame of reference or a lens is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, all people have these same physiological needs. We need food, water, shelter, safety, and then we have to solve each level before we can meet the needs working our way up. But I think it's something that we can apply to cities, groups of people as well. We all need a healthy environment. We need clean air to breathe. We need water to drink. We need public safety, and we can use this as a lens to view cities and neighborhoods to say, what is missing? What is not being accomplished here? And we work our way up. And so I'm going to talk mostly about this middle part, which is, we're talking about upward mobility. How do we create that? Which is education. One is having the skills, but also being able to get to where you need to go, because cities are fundamentally about exchange, right? Cities are the physical form of economies, and economies are want and need of being able to meet those wants and needs through exchange. So that's a little technical, but it's about what is the role of transportation? Are we just building so people can move, or are we building so people can connect, which is what cities are about? And when people tend to define mobility, they're like, how can we drive, right? How do we make people drive? It's like, well, to what ends is that? Okay, people are in cars and they're driving. Now, what are the results of that? On the other hand, then cities will say, well, we need all these other forms of transportation too, because other cities have them, right? And so we have to have the trains and the buses, and we want to get around by pedestrian or by walking and by biking as well. And the question is this additive or is it reductive? Is investing in one actually hurting the investments in the other? Also, do we adequately price for all of this driving, for all of this infrastructure, for all the externalities that are created from driving, from pollution, congestion, and all these different things, as well as time and stress spent in the car? I mean, I gave up a car for 8 years, and people were like, was it the money? It was like, no, I felt like shit just being in a car and getting out of a car. I was angry getting out of a car. I was like, this is not me. I'm not a human anymore. I hate everybody around me because they're all drivers getting in my way. Is it equitable? Can everybody afford a car? And obviously, you have to be 16 years old, have a driver's license, have the ability, have the means to own and operate a car. That's obviously not everybody. So how do we design for all ages, all income levels, people to be able to meet their needs? On the other hand, are those other forms of infrastructure and transportation, are they safe, convenient, reliable? Can they compete with this, or otherwise everybody's just going to get in the car and drive anyway? And then how do we actually design our cities to maximize choice? And that choice has to be actually legitimate and convenient as well, or else you don't really have choice. We just have train as a trinket, right? It's just an object that we collect to look like a city. On the other hand, what I suggest is that we need this fancy term called propinquity, which is, instead of how do we get to places, how do we arrange development in cities so more things are closer to you, right? Are they convenient? Your first place is your home, your second place is where you go to work, and third place is all those other places that you go to and spend time and you meet other people, right? Because cities are also, the places of serendipity, right? Where you go meet the next person that you might become friends with, business partners with, you never know. And this is an isochrone map, which is basically a map showing how far you can get in a certain amount of time in a city. And this is, hey, in 30 minutes from East Dallas, that's how far you can get on public transit. And we say, okay, let's try to get as far as possible. But on the other hand, we haven't asked, well, how do we actually allocate all of our daily needs within those things so we don't have to try to go as far as possible? So this is walk score. Is anybody familiar with the data walk score, which is basically a quantitative measure of all your daily needs and how close they are? Of course, Uptown, which is this area here, we're currently right down here, it's got all of those daily needs are up there, right? Because density's up, and so amenity then comes and surrounds itself to density because the demand is there. But then that's purely quantitative. It's not qualitative. And I've been working with Uptown Public Improvement District for the past couple of years to deal with this problem and how do we reframe what their issues are, because in the story of Uptown is that in the 1970s or so, we basically built a bunch of one-way large roads to get people through there as quickly as possible, right? And it's basically mostly is to get people from Highland Park through the black neighborhood to get to jobs in downtown and get them out as fast as possible. That ended up destabilizing and causing disinvestment in the neighborhood, which eventually led, hey, here's land next to downtown. People saw the opportunity, said, let's put as many people back as possible. And it has densified, right? It wasn't that way all the time. In the 1980s and 90s, it was virtually a ghost town. Everybody had left. But what's happened now is that we've maximized space for people in the private realm while we're maximizing space for cars, and what's left is this tiny little strip where street trees and utilities and bicycles and pedestrians and even strollers, because the fastest growing population segment in Uptown is now 0 to 5, all have to compete for the same space, right? And so we have to rethink that because we have to be able to get people around. Now that we have density, the question is, what's the most efficient way to move the most amount of people around in a certain space? This is 60 people in pedestrians, 60 people on bikes, 60 people in cars, or 60 people on a bus. Because thinking about transportation, you have limited volume of space unless you just keep widening and widening and widening and widening roads to the point where you no longer have places to live or work or anything else. You just create big roads everywhere. So it's fundamentally about geometry, and then we have to ask, okay, in each travel lane, which is that given amount of space, how many people can we move per hour that way? And it's just about being efficient with our dollars, because ultimately infrastructure is the public cost for the economy to work. I think this will probably make sense to everybody in that we have to align our policies and our budgets, because budgets is actually what we prioritize to actions. And I like this. This is a fractal diagram, because I think of cities like a fractal as well. And fractals, you repeat the same process over and over and over again to create something new entirely, almost entirely new organism. And that's really the way cities operate too. The cities basically create their priorities and goals around simple things, simple ideas, and then they repeat that decision-making process over and over and over again. And then it ends up creating this thing we call city, right? Even though it may be about a land use decision or a property decision, that we just repeat those over and over and over again. Next thing you know, we have a different organism in the city. And the question is, what are we prioritizing? What are the lens we're viewing our decisions through? And traffic engineers for the last 50 or so years have been incredibly effective by creating this grading system, level A to level F, what is good and what is failing. And we've started to determine everything. It's like, that's how we're going to frame our decision-making process. A means free flow. There's no stopping in traffic, because we all hate sitting in traffic, and so we internalize that and say, "Oh, hey, good. I don't like traffic." Well, then, what is the impact if we make that same decision on every single road throughout the entire city? And then the question is, then, who designs the city? Is it the engineer, where a level of service A, nobody else is the perfect road, nobody else is in the way, nobody's going to hit you, the safest road, it's an empty road, right? Well, the question is, what does the economist say? Well, the economist would rather have this, where there's tax base, there's social and economic activity happening, but all that is in the way, right? That's all that activity is stuff in the way of moving cars. So the question is, what are we actually prioritizing? What are we trying to build? This is in West Dallas, or Design District area, Irving Boulevard. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, but it moves about 16,000 cars per day. It's built for about 48,000 cars per day, but it's really only used for about 2 or 3 hours, morning rush hour and evening rush hour. And of course, this is then, because it's a ghost town most of the time, this is the value of the real estate to be along it. It's really not that built up, it's not optimized. And we've got about $14.58 per square foot in the real estate. On the other hand, a road much smaller, this is in suburban Detroit, it actually moves 24,000 cars per day, much smaller road, but it's got activity all day, all night, because there's things to do there. It's friendly for people to be there and spend time there. It's not just about saving time, it's about also spending time. Then of course, the real estate then, even though it's still one-story buildings, is 6 times the real estate value. Not just the real estate value, that's not just private gain, but that's also then tax base to maintain our infrastructure. Similar idea, this is 635 in Dallas. This is really now the center of town as town has migrated to the north. Moves about 250,000 vehicles per day. You say, well, great, it's moving a lot of cars. This is Champs-Élysées in Paris, the center of their town. Moves 80,000 cars per day. It's like, well, that's not as good as moving 250,000 cars, right? Not as much economic activity. But then it's also got 500,000 pedestrians per day, and it's moving 1 million people in the subway line below on the M1 line. And then, of course, the impact of all that means the real estate value is more than 10 times on half the right-of-way, on half the infrastructure. And this gets a little technical, but cities are built on grids. They don't have to be perfectly rectilinear grids, but it's all about redundancy. There's choice in route, there's choice in mode, and if something happens right here, I can reroute, and so they're adaptable as well. And that's really the point of the grid. It's not advantaging going from one point A to one point B, but advantaging all directions equally. And what that means is that it filters the bad, which is congestion, it spreads traffic out. Not only in geometrically to spread out, but also spreads it out by mode, and then it aggregates the good because businesses and amenities and things want to cluster. And then that redundancy allows multimodal infrastructure because you've got all that extra space, so you can have the trains on one corridor, bike lanes on another corridor, bus lanes on another corridor, and still gets people to where they want to go. And this is a quote I found in a 1912 city plan of St. Louis that has really influenced much of my work, which is the science of urban design, is to design all of our public spaces, our infrastructure, our streets, and our parks to maximize the private use of land. Because the private use of land then means we're not spreading out, we're not sprawling, and we can also maintain all of our infrastructure, maintain our parks, but then we also have money for amenity as well. And in the perception in the real estate market, this is for the Trek crew, is that we think that we want to be on traffic, right? Because traffic means value. How many cars are moving by? But we really don't see much investment and reinvestment along places like this, along highways. Somebody once built there because there's accessibility there, but it's really not that accessible because you have to make the right exit, you have to turn around if you miss it. And it's really hard to get to. On the other hand, what really is value is the amount of people that can and want to access a space, right? So this is La Rambla in Barcelona. It's like which would you rather spend time at? And sort of to make a graphic out of that whole concept is what is the tax burden, our infrastructure, in order to have tax base, right? Which is the private realm. The thing is, what we never do, and we're just starting to learn, is that we have to actually factor life cycle costs into our infrastructure because we're not building to maintain them. There's just a one-time cost that's out there, and then guess what? If we don't have enough tax base, we got to rebuild this thing, and we don't have enough money to do it. And I was just talking to Brett, we end up sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul because we're saying we got to solve congestion. And so city councils and government, they say, well, we got to take money from the police, we got to take money from giving to arts or from schools, and it all ends up going to building bigger and bigger and bigger roads. And I want to talk a little bit about what the impact then on cities that has. So we can actually shrink through design and through policy what our tax burden is in order to maximize tax base. We create something where we actually we start shooting off more revenue than we can maintain. For example, Uptown creates 30 times the tax base per acre than anywhere else in the city. 30 times. It basically pays for everything else. And 20 years ago, it was worth about 400 million totally, and now it's over 6 billion, just the area of Uptown. So the answer is we need more Uptowns. And when people say, well, it's expensive, it's like, that's why we need more of it, because it's in demand and there's not enough of it. So I did something similar, but I looked at Collin County, said, what are the different kinds of real estate sectors in Collin County? So we've got downtown Plano, we've got Legacy. Everybody familiar with Shops of Legacy? That was one of the first projects I worked on, the first couple phases. And then we've got typical sort of single family homes. And there's all sorts of different ones, corporate office campus, shopping mall, strip center retail, and I looked at what is the per acre tax base of each of those kinds of development. And it's actually the historic downtown is performing the best. It's actually so compact in terms of the building and the activity that it's on. And the thing is, if you don't have enough of this, you can't afford all of this because every single property has cost of services to it, the infrastructure. And if you're not having too much of this, you end up in that sort of systemic decline and decay. And the result, of course, is systematic bankrupting of all of our institutions. Same with what was happening in New York City, in Vancouver, in Melbourne, and Copenhagen. And so when we say, okay, let's apply our goals, what are our priorities? And this is from the 2045 Long Range Regional Plan. And this is basically projecting where everybody's going to live in the next 30 years, as if we know, as if we should care, right? Because we're basically just take our current ideals and say, well, let's just keep expanding in the same way and apply them 30 years in the future. Not thinking about what technological changes are going to be. How are we going to be getting around in 30 years? We don't know. And we're also not asking where people should be, because the most dense color here, the darkest red, is less than what we need to actually efficiently serve with transit. We actually need at least 12,000 people per square mile. So we're not even showing decent density. This is all low density everywhere. Then I subtracted through Photoshop all the areas where people currently live. And what we're basically saying is everybody's just going to keep getting further and further and further out. So is that actually a good thing for us? Can we afford that? And what they do is they say, oh, if we don't build all these new roads and expand all these highways, congestion everywhere, severe congestion. The entire city is going to be congested. It's going to be gridlocked. Nobody's going to be able to get anywhere. Again, we're just saying we're taking our current behavior patterns, our current modes of getting around, how much we're driving, and then we just smear that across a larger area and say, oh, guess what? Everything fails, unless we just keep building roads. Well, how does that actually work? At the same time, we're prioritizing. You see what we're prioritizing in the charts that we're creating. How long does it take us to drive from Dallas to Denton? Wait a second. Should that even be a concern? And if we do that, why are we trying to encourage people to make that daily trip over an hour every single day? Is that good behavior for people? Can they afford to do that? Can they afford the car? Can they afford the gas? Can they afford the time that it takes to keep doing that? And so why are we prioritizing that rather than saying, why isn't where we work closer to where we live? Right? That's a more efficient trip, and I'd have more ways to get around. And how do we do that for everybody? So when we say congestion, let's actually talk about what congestion is. Well, it's the triple convergence of mode. Everybody's in car, right? It takes the most space. And we're competing for the same space. So we're all funneled onto these highways. We have the second longest average trip length in terms of mileage to get to work in the entire country. And time. That everybody's competing at the same times. Rush hour morning, rush hour at night. And the thing is about that is our highway system can't expand and contract with those loads, right? Because they're built to be one capacity. We try to maximize them, but there's limits on that because there's cost and getting the real estate and all that. But it's unlike transit, where all we have to do is drop another train on the track and we've just doubled capacity in the same limited space. So let's talk about the flip side of that. What are actually the costs? And there's a report that comes out of the Texas Transportation Institute every couple of years that drives me insane because everybody quotes it all over the country and they're like it's gospel. And they say, well, congestion is costing the country $120 billion per year. Okay, that seems like a big number. That's a scary number. How do we not waste $120 billion in congestion every year? But what if we added up all the other costs of car dependence? That ends up being $2 trillion per year that car dependence is costing the country, and accidents and maintaining cars and the infrastructure and parking and all those various things. When we look back at that 120 billion number, we take that per capita, that's only $400 a year per capita. That's really just the cost of doing business. And we really haven't been effective at lowering that at all. But we can lower that just by design and policy. And when we just keep trying to expand highways, this is a chart of highway capacity to population density. The more highway capacity we add, the lower the population density. People end up spreading out. The more highway capacity we build per capita, the more we end up driving. So we just end up driving more. So we're driving further. Is that actually a good return on investment? That people just end up driving more and therefore the roads end up filling up again? I don't think I have it in here, but I had a case study that I talk about sometimes. It's the 405 highway in LA, and it's the busiest highway in the entire country. They spent the last 5 years widening it, and they spent $1 billion to do it, and it now moves slower than what it did before they started the expansion. Is that a good return on investment? No, it's not. And the funny thing is that no matter how much highway capacity we build, the commute time is always about the same. Every single city is 25 to 30 minutes. And what researchers have found is that all cities throughout time have been about 30 minutes wide. Because no matter what the mode is, we want there's a certain real estate dynamic there that people want a certain amount of distance between where they work. It's just all about the mode of travel that it takes. And this is sort of a fun diagram. It's not a real place. This is Photoshop.
It gives me heart palpitations. Oh.
Exactly. Now let's say you used to live there, you lived there and you worked there. Once upon a time, you used to be able to walk, a nice short, quick walk, but now you don't want to play Frogger on that, and you don't want to live next to all that pollution either. You say, oh, guess what? You know, that highway now means there's cheaper real estate up the road 15 miles. I'm going to move up there where it's cheaper, and plus I don't want to deal with that. Then everybody else ends up doing that too, and they all end up on the same highway driving the same distance. And so the thing is that not only is this a barrier across ways, it becomes a barrier lengthwise, distance-wise. Because even though they're purporting to say, well, this is going to connect people, as the market just adapts to that and starts stretching out and sparsifying, we all get further and further and further apart. And then therefore that distance becomes a barrier to serendipity, to exchange, and everything else. You take our average trip length to commute, draw that from the center of Dallas, and that means we're outside the boundaries of the city of Dallas entirely. Why does that matter? State tax, sales tax go to the state, property taxes go to the city. And if you're living out here, you're taking your property tax outside of the city and then using the city's infrastructure inside the city. That means the city can barely maintain itself because you've taken your property taxes outside the city by not living and working in the same place. I don't have it on this one either, but there's a interesting data point from New York City that, can you guess where the #1 borough that everybody works in? In New York City, there's 5 boroughs, right? Manhattan, Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island, I'm missing one, Bronx, yeah. Do you know where everybody works? The #1 commuting destination where everybody works? No, only Manhattan's #1 destination is Manhattan. The #1 work destination for every other borough is that borough. People actually work closer to where they live. So it's not about trying to get people to move as far as possible. It's about how do we get as much opportunity where people currently live. And another side note, they tried to build 2 highways across Manhattan. And a woman named Jane Jacobs actually organized the fights against that. And they blocked those 2 highways that would have blown through Manhattan in order to connect New Jersey to Brooklyn. Well, why do we need to connect New Jersey to Brooklyn? You can actually get there other ways. You don't have to drive. But they thought that was progress once upon a time. And the question is always, what are the outcomes? What are the unintended consequences of what people are trying to do, even if we assume that those actions were in good intentions? Okay, back to where I was really going. The result of all that is that we've actually built the least amount of housing over the last 15, 20 years in infill locations, back where people currently live. Instead, it's on greenfield. Greenfield never before built on real estate, the most of any other major city. We just keep getting further and further and further out. Yes, we're growing, but that's the percentage of that growth, and just keeps getting, that's the percentage of growth that actually goes back towards the city, and it's not enough. Of course, the flip side of that is how much we spend to get around. So Houston, I've got this data for Houston, not Dallas, but Houston's basically a proxy statistically to Dallas-Fort Worth because they're almost the same globally. 95% of trips in Houston are by car. About the same here. But they spend 14% of their metro GDP on infrastructure. That's both public and private expenditures. New York, they spend 10% of their GDP on infrastructure and moving around. Paris, 7%. Copenhagen, where it's only 54% of trips, and that's probably below 50% now, they only spend 4% of their GDP on transportation. They're making the same trips, right? Because they're still people with the same wants and needs. Same exchange is happening. They're going to work, they're going to parks, they're going to school, all the above. But they're spending 10% less of their GDP to do so. To me, that means that's waste. To our economy, that means $50 billion that could be staying in the local economy, could be staying in people's wallets. They could be investing in better housing and businesses, savings, whatever they want to do. Again, choice. Right? So it's not just choice in transportation mode, it becomes choice to do with your dollars.
What was that location below?
This is Copenhagen.
Okay.
I highly recommend it, but go in August. It's really the only time it's warm. But they bike in the snow, it's crazy. And the impact of that sort of sparsification of cities means transit is not terribly useful. And this is again the percentage of people that are in poverty or struggling, living paycheck to paycheck, in proportion to the percentage of jobs that they can actually get to in a 40-minute commute. The places with the highest percentage of poverty or paycheck to paycheck, they can't get to jobs in other ways other than owning a car. So the cost of the car, which is like $10,000 to own and operate a car, which you'd say 2-car household, that's $20,000 a year. Median household income in Dallas is $45,000. That's nearly half the take-home pay for a median household just to make a paycheck. All because of car dependence. So the question is, what do we do then? Well, we had that isochrone map. It's like, how do we expand that? How do we expand the reach and accessibility of other modes? So it's not just by car, it's not just how do we drive to Denton, but also then how do we simultaneously reinvest and get more things close to where people currently live? How do we revitalize inward rather than growing outward? I'm sure everybody's familiar with Bishop Arts. You've got a room, that's Bishop Arts. This is Bishop Arts in 1985. Jim Lake Jr., who now owns most of it, this was his dad invested in the area just because he thought it was neat and wanted to protect it. 1985, this was the worst part of town. Uptown was the other one. Uptown and Bishop Arts were the two worst parts of town 30 years ago. People find that amazing considering what they are now, because that's what Bishop Arts is now. And so there's a special issue of D Magazine coming out where I'm going to have about 5,000 words in it this summer. And one of the issues is going to be, how do we take Bishop Arts and this 30-year timeline that it took to get it to where it is, how do we do many of those and compress that timeline into 3 to 5 years? How do we make many places like that? Because what has happened in both Uptown and Bishop Arts, because they're in so much demand and so few of them, they end up pricing 95% of the population out of them. The question is, how do we flood the market then with places people love? And people love this, because I don't have the slide here because I guess it was just too much, but it's where everybody takes their engagement photos. So just Google Dallas engagement photos. It's always in Bishop Arts, I swear. And places, we don't have to get into specifics of them, but we've got places all over the city that have those same kind of good bones that were basically almost all built before 1945, before the war. And we can talk about what happened after the war that caused all that. But they tend to have the same things of high unemployment, low incomes, but fixable infrastructure problems too. And that's where we go in, and that's where the intervention tends to happen. We say, how do we rethink that? Because what they did, early 2000s, they spent about $1.5 million to redo the streetscape. From that to that, they didn't really even expand the sidewalks too much, but the street trees, the shade, the brick, everything became a little bit nicer. But that was one of many things that was done. But we know all of these various things that were done to help. They reduced the parking requirement. So if I was to open a business here, I don't have to knock down the building next to me to provide parking. The parking was all basically externalized into the neighborhood. I live here, and people park all over the place. And you know what? That's the cost of living there, because I can now walk to everything I need. There'll be a grocery store there soon too. Similar thing was done in Lower Greenville. And we just took an example. This is Bonneview and Cedar Crest, also an old streetcar stop once upon a time. This is what it looks like today. There's about 2,000 cars that use this road, right? And of course, we have to widen it so everybody can drive through here as quickly as possible. Again, it's not a spend time space, it's a save time space. How do you get through there as quickly as possible? But it's got the good bones, historic buildings. They just need some TLC, and we need people space, not how do we get people through there as soon as possible. First thing that Jim Lake Sr. did, he set up a police outpost. Because remember that hierarchy of needs, you have to have safety. Well, we could do that. Then we could also set up street markets where serve as an incubator, but also to redefine the public realm as a place to spend time. So you can have people that live nearby say, hey, come out, sell stuff, right? Come and have a tent. We'll set it up, and we'll set it up in the street, and we'll change the nature of the street for a place that you can walk around and see different things. So it becomes a social gathering place, not just a conveyance thing for cars. Then we come back in, we redesign the streetscape, we expand the sidewalks, we pull the parking in, we narrow the road, we calm the traffic, so it's not about driving through as quickly as possible. And then eventually we take from those entrepreneurs that were starting in the markets, and we start populating the storefronts with their businesses. And then systematically over time, we can start bringing in different kinds of housing types, townhomes and small apartments, and we can redesign this intersection, which is obnoxious right now, into a square. So now there's a center gathering place there as well. So all this pavement just became green space. We're doing something similar in Uptown. I don't know how many people live in Uptown or spend a lot of time in Uptown. There's a Starbucks at Allen and McKinney. Terrible intersection right there. That's going to be a plaza someday soon. We've got that funded. We're converting McKinney and Cole Avenue to two-way streets, and we're taking all those intersections and making plazas out of them. We've got $20 million to do it over the next couple of years. Same idea here. Take big bad intersections of just unnecessary pavement, redesign it for people's space. And then systematically over time, the institutional capital can come in afterwards. So I don't know if you've heard of the Grow South Fund. Well, that Grow South Fund can't find any places to build because it still needs return on investment. And it wants to build 250 unit kind of buildings. Well, guess what? That kind of institutional capital is not going to pioneer the area. So we have to sort of ready the area for that larger investment to come in. But then at the same time, similar with Bishop Arts, these businesses need that population density nearby. Because Bishop Arts, they're starting to franchise out all of those businesses like an incubator. So everything that's happening in Frisco, hey, we need that from Deep Ellum, we need that business from Bishop Arts. And they're actually losing market share to their other businesses elsewhere in the region because they're no longer a regional destination. So we have to replace the market with population density. Again, the isochrome, how do we expand from that to that? One way to do that, we can look at what Houston did. This is their frequent bus network, which means all day, 15 minutes or better, you've got buses on these red routes. They said, you know what, let's rethink our bus network, and they expanded using the same budget to that. All day, 15-minute network. And they just basically just eliminated waste everywhere. Buses taking convoluted routes and doing whatever, and say, we're going to concentrate our services on these key routes, and you can now get everywhere in the city. And the importance of the frequency, 15 minutes, means, well, rarely can you get everywhere on one line. You're usually going to have to make some kind of connection. In DART system, 50% of our trips have a connection. That means you want the frequency because that compresses the time that you're waiting on those connections. So now you can get further faster just by concentrating service. To compare Houston's frequent network overlaid on their population density and job clusters to our frequent network. This is what we're working on right now. As chair of operations, this is a priority of mine. We've got one high frequency bus route in the entire system. Just one. Wow. Our rail system is radial. It's all concentrated in downtown. But that means we're only hitting 6.5% of the jobs in our coverage area. And it's only about 7% of the land area if you take like sort of a half-mile walk shed to all of our stations. So our rail is not covering everybody. We're not serving everybody. How do we serve everybody else? And that's where I started looking at the arterial grid of the city. Say we can use the bus network, improved bus network, concentrate service on those north-south, east-west movements, and now we're connecting the entire city. Our job clusters, primarily downtown, medical district, and we said if we concentrate our service on these certain corridors, patterns start to emerge, and we've got a network where our hubs are our largest business clusters. Seattle, not only do you need frequency, you also need reliability and speed. Seattle's been investing in their rapid ride network, which means dedicated lanes, high frequency, buses moving by every 5-10 minutes. But the best thing about that is if somebody else is stuck in traffic, they're seeing the best advertisement for transit possible. Buses passing them as they're stuck at lights. They've got signal priority, dedicated lanes, and their ridership on those rapid rides has been going up. When they had 1 line, 2 lines, 4 lines, 6 lines, their ridership keeps going up and up and up because it's the most convenient way to get around. And then that provides a road network for our housing policy, for where we put infrastructure investments, where the city knows to put bike improvements and pedestrian improvements at these nodes where the best service is. And that best service can often be at failed retail corners where we've got some distressed assets and some empty big boxes. We could say, well, how do we rethink some of those single-purpose retail corners? They're not just single-purpose, but now they're villages where we've got multi-uses there, everything you want and need. And the question, the conclusion of this is why? Why do we do all this? Why do we build infrastructure? Why do we care about all this? But ultimately, cities are about social and economic exchange and facilitating that, and to be as efficient as possible, because cities and city form is a form of productivity. We have to compress space and time. Things have to be closer together because that reduces the spatial costs and the energy costs to encourage transaction, to encourage innovation because you're meeting new people, coming in contact with new ideas. And we can't have those barriers of distance and time and energy because ultimately, all cities are competing in the competition of cities in the 21st century is that those that succeed will be those that are the most livable, that empower the most percentage of their population. And that's really why we have to do that, because ultimately that opportunity and that choice is the rising tide that will lift all boats. And so I don't know if I went too long. I've got some stuff I think on 345 later if you want to talk about that. So another fun fact, I found this in the presidential archives, that President Eisenhower, the father of the interstate system, never actually wanted highways built through the center of cities. Because he knew that that's the most congested part. It's hard to move military through congested parts of cities, but of course that's what we did. And here's 345. I don't have some of the data slides. But
Tell everybody what 345
oh, 345, that's the highway between downtown and Deep Ellum. Just if you walk under Ross or if you walk under Main Elm Commerce, when I first moved here, I used to walk from here over to my first job in downtown every single day, and I would wonder what else could this be, because I would walk past vacant land, surface parking lots, boarded up buildings, and I was like, this shouldn't be like this. This is not productive real estate. This is not a place I want to spend time. I like to have a 15-minute walk. That was fun, but it wasn't a pleasant walk. Then I started looking into the data and found that the land around the highway, including the land into the highway, which is publicly owned land, is only producing like $3.5 million per year in tax base. So it's 245 acres around it. It was producing $3.5 million. If we tore that out, redeveloped it, we would actually have $4 to $5 billion in private investment that would create 110 million per year in new tax base for the city. And that's roughly 28,000 new residents, 23,000 new jobs, new parks, everything else. And so what's happened with that too, I don't know if I have any slides on the process of it, but once upon a time, the city in downtown Dallas did the original 360 plan, which was in 2009 or 10. They said, okay, in that they literally said the highway loop around downtown is a problem, but there's nothing we can do about that. And I said, well, why are we editing ourselves? If we're saying it's a problem, why don't we correct the problem and then think about how? So I was having beer with a developer friend, and we said, well, what if we just theoretically took out a highway? What if we did the study? What is the economic impact, quality of life impact? And let's find what the numbers are, and we can make a case. We looked at all the highways around downtown back then. Woodall Rogers or Clyde Warren Park was getting built. There were plans for 30, there were plans for 35 from TxDOT. Nobody was talking about 345. We said this timing is perfect. We started researching it. Turned out that it was a 39-year-old highway and a 40-year lifespan, and we were like, we need to act now. And eventually TxDOT showed up. They showed up, had their public meeting, and said, here's 9 concepts. And we said, these aren't 9 concepts, these are 9 price tags to keep an elevated highway, just constructing it differently. And we created quite the stink in the media, luckily. And the governor-appointed commissioner over TxDOT, over our area, saw that and said, hey, let's go talk about it. Met him out under the highway for 2 hours in the rain one day. He was like, you know what, you're right. And we were pushing the city. It's like, hey, we got to do something about this. And Trek, the real estate council, said, we'll fund the study. We'll fund an engineering study to look at this. And the city, and previous management, said, no thanks. TxDOT knows what they're doing. Well, okay. So that's when our commissioner, Vandergriff, said, we'll look at it. So TxDOT said, we will study the impacts of this. And he was right to say, he looked at it the same way we did, said, okay, what are the impacts of this highway beyond the boundaries of the highway? And this is the first time the state DOT has ever done that in the entire country, looking at the economic impact of different options. And the 3 options they looked at was just a modified version where they would eliminate some ramps and it would just be a purely pass-through, a below-grade option, like Woodall Rogers over here, and a complete destruction of it entirely that would be replaced with service boulevards. The thing about this highway is that it disconnects most of the roads that are north-south. And again, I don't think I have the slide here, but this holds about 150,000 cars per day, or moves about 150,000 cars per day. Its capacity is really only about 140, which is why it's a parking lot for 6 hours a day. If we actually reconnected all of these north-south streets, we could handle 180,000 cars per day. But we would also reroute the truck traffic, which is 16 to 20% of the traffic around the city. Trucks don't want to be stuck in cities, just like with the military, right? You're trying to move troops from one coast to the other coast, you don't want to go through the center of the city because it slows it down. And that was Eisenhower's point. That's also not good for trucking and shipping. You want them moving. So we actually have more capacity on street grids, but we would also be reinvesting in all that land, all that public land, to deliver the things that we need, which would be new parks. We'd be able to deliver affordable housing, a range of affordability levels, where we need it to be, which is near jobs and near transit. We've been successful enough that we had TxDOT did that study. And now they're actually going through full engineering documents on it too to better understand the cost, because they came to the same conclusion as we did, even though they weren't coming out and saying, here's what you should do. They said, here are your options. You make up your mind. And of course, guess what? The best economic and everything was, hey, just get rid of the highway entirely, because we want to grow back towards the city. And now they're actually doing engineering documents for it. So it's potentially a real possibility. I never thought I would be in politics. But it turns out I helped found the Political Action Committee, which then, City Council election 2015, we raised $500,000, and we went from 4 council people out of 15 that supported us to 7. 2017, we went from 7 to 10. So we now have a super majority that supports removing the highway. But we don't have to support the state level yet, though. That's the harder part. But we just keep moving, keep leveling up and finding one more battle, but we're still working on it. But that's where that stands now. Anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Okay, so I think the 345 question is very interesting. One of the things and he spoke about this at our CEO meeting, so would love to talk about that. One of the things you talked about was this idea of, and you touched on it just now, this idea that if you run these interstates and freeways through a downtown, a significant portion of that traffic isn't going to downtown, it's just passing through. And so this idea of, really what you want to do is connect people and get them to downtown and get them into the downtown, and then pass through traffic you want to route outside. It gets the whole point of the interstate highway system, and Eisenhower saying, I don't want it to go through downtown. Somebody, they messed that up. And I thought that your case study that you did on the Canadian city, I don't remember if it was Calgary or Toronto. Vancouver, thank you. But you had a picture of that and you talked about the decisions they made back in the 60s that they consciously made and happened, the traffic they were planning to do and what they did. So if you could describe that a little bit, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, so I do have a couple slides, and they're not in this one, unfortunately, where I contrast Detroit and Vancouver, which are the only 2 cities in North America that solved congestion. Right? One lost 1 million people and one gained 1 million people. But in Detroit, what they did was the same most places in the U.S. They're like, we need to, get the highways in downtown, because in Detroit, there was the richest city in the world after the war, because they basically built the war machine. And they said, we want to be the greatest city in the world. They were already called the Paris of the West, right? It was a beautiful city, and they said, you know what? Let's build highways everywhere. And they did it. And guess what happened? A lot of the businesses and people ended up moving outside the city. The city lost population, but the region has the same population of about 5 million people that did in 1950, 1960. On the other hand, because they were like, hey, there are destinations in downtown. This is sort of the machine works of planning and transportation. It's like there's a lot of destinations downtown. That means the road needs to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, what happens if all those destinations leave, right? And you're left with this empty highway. On the flip side, Vancouver said, we are not allowing any highways into our city at all. If you go to Vancouver, the highways stop right at the border. And the decision was, we don't want them. Everybody in the world made fun of them. You're going to be a backwater or whatnot. But guess what happened? It became a desirable place to live. It's got, of course, beautiful geography. But what happens in those highways is it scales down to a boulevard, then it scales down and just completely disappears into the street grid entirely. And that street grid actually has much more capacity than they were planning for the highways. So it's actually worked out for them, because they've got the density that supports transit. They've got the amenities close by where you don't have to get in the car, so you're actually expanding capacity because everybody's not in cars. And so you can get to all your destinations in a much more efficient and safer way as well. We've got cities and countries all over the world are now getting behind this idea called Vision Zero. Vision Zero means they want to get to 0 traffic fatalities in a year. Last year in Texas, we had 3,500. I think in Dallas, we had about 150 or so. And their goal is to get to 0, but they know they're probably never going to get to 0. The point is to systematically reduce it, and all their design decisions, instead of ameliorating congestion, is we want less traffic deaths. Right? And so every decision is now focused on how do we reduce traffic deaths and improve safety. Copenhagen 1 year got down to one traffic fatality in the entire city. To me, that's something that we should get behind politically, and start to have some conversations of how do we pass that. Because LA has done the same, and then now they've got a whole website that's amazing. It tracks all the most dangerous roads and intersections, and people can see it. and then people would say, hey, you need to fix my intersection because there's been a fatality or whatever, and now the city knows where to put its dollars to try to improve those corridors, those intersections or whatnot to make them safer. So fundamentally, it's about slowing cars down because that's essentially a deadly weapon, and none of us are very good at operating it. Because then what happens is that things just get closer together because places are more desirable. So the demand is, I'd be close to that. So we're not trying to move cars as fast as possible and then deal with all those externalities of just trying to move cars. I don't know if that's a long and winding way to go from Vancouver to Copenhagen, but
That's great. Thank you. Any other questions? All right, Chippy. Oh, Marie. So we'll do you first.
You kind of mentioned this when you were talking about Bishop Arts and the Cedar Crest area.
Mhm.
Obviously, it's a hard balance to strike, I imagine, in going in and developing communities without pushing people out. And I know you talked about how when you have limited demand, obviously that impacts that. But I'm just curious, that's a nationwide problem that people talk about all the time. And what are some of the ways outside of maybe just increasing demand that you've seen people have been able to strike that balance with having a cool new area where I can go walk around and shop, but without having to have rent raised for people who, and I know it probably is impossible, but I'm just curious so that we can be more educated, because in Dallas.
The term is gentrification, and everybody has a different definition of it, which I think is one of the hard parts of dealing with the conversation. To one person it means displacement, to another person it means investment. So the question is, how do we take investment, which is good, and harness it for the most amount of people? I mean, one thing about this plan and this idea is that we're actually, all the orange, which is new housing, there's nothing else, it's all on vacant land, right? So it's not demolition to construct, but it's infill, selective infill in certain places. Of course, you raise the desirability of this, you're gonna raise rents and all that. So what you have to do at the same time, and not a lot of places have been successful in this or care, is how do you make sure everybody else is empowered to be able to capitalize on this growth, right? So it means you want people in ownership. We're dealing with South Dallas. There's very low ownership of the homes there. How do you get people into ownership? The West Dallas issue, the landlord is basically selling at zero interest all of his properties to the current tenants. So once they're in ownership, they're empowered to sell or not sell, and that's an important part of it. Or do people have the proper skills training and business resources to open a business? Part of this, I have the blue thing that would be like the police substation. It doesn't have to be the police substation. It also could be a small business support center. We've got those around the city, but they tend to be in anonymous retail centers. So the most important thing is empowerment. What we're seeing in the Bishop Arts area is that people that bought for $20,000 or $30,000 20 years ago are now selling between $300,000 and $600,000. Those people are making off, and they're like, you know what? I'm going to cash in. I'm going to go move somewhere else. That's fine. On the other hand, there are some apartments that have been demolished, and we don't know what happens to those people that have been displaced. Are they ending up in better housing? We don't know. And that's the hard part that we have to sort of solve. And the other part of this is that we don't, we want many of them happening at the same time. So we don't have that just sort of one-off, hey, Uptown's now expensive, pushes everybody out by rent. Bishop Arts is now expensive, pushing everybody out. We want to flood the market with it. But at the same time, we also want to leverage all public assets to deliver a range of affordability. So like with 345, that's all public land, right? And right now, the city really doesn't have much leverage over development, where other cities like Vancouver, they say, hey, if our land is valuable, if you want to develop on it, you've got to provide a daycare or a school or a park or some kind of public good in order to deliver the density that you want to deliver. They have that kind of leverage. We don't. We would actually have it with like 345, but that's not the only public land that we have. We also have DART lands. We've got Dallas Housing Authority land. We've got DISD land where we've got kids in trailers still for 20 years. It's like, okay. An example in DC, there's a place called the Oyster School. They had a dated, failing facility. Private sector came in and said, you know what, if we can build 200 housing units here, we'll build you a new school. So they built the school, delivered a range of affordability housing units as well. We could do that. So there's a lot of different strategies. There's no one magic bullet. We have to be doing sort of all of these things at once. And a lot of that's going to end up in the D-magazine piece that we're that we're working on. So it's a hard one, but as long as people pay attention and care and don't stop investment and stop new housing. I mean, Seattle's been building housing like crazy, and they're actually starting to see rents come down because of the supply they're adding.
Okay, Renita's next, but one question. When's that D Magazine article coming out?
It's going to be a special issue, so there's 13th issue, but it's going to be sometime in the summer. And it's actually going to be sent out nationwide to investment banks and all sorts of REITs and everything else.
Sometime this summer. Okay, great. All right.
You said that when you originally started doing everything with the Dart, you never imagined yourself getting involved politically at the local level. How would you recommend an average everyday person works, maybe even has a family, get involved in all of this and give their voice heard?
It depends on what you're passionate about. So you're not gonna stay involved in something if you're not passionate about it. So the first thing is you have to find that. If you want to be involved in sort of urban issues, well, there's your neighborhood. Does your neighborhood have a neighborhood association? Have you joined that? What are kind of public improvements that your neighborhood needs? How do you organize and then build a constituency to then go to your council person or whatever, say, hey, we need this. That's, I think, the first thing. Really, it's like you got to just follow your heart and your need. You know, how do you make your neighborhood better?
Well, we got a bunch of them. Okay, Richard.
Most important thing is organizing.
How does the advent of the self-driving car and that kind of incoming trend impact any of this?
Yeah, so I am a fan because we were bad drivers, right? And let's say it becomes perfect at some point in time and we sort out all the liability issues and regulatory environment, all that. Let's say at some point in time we hit 100% market saturation of AVs. That's still just a technology, right? And we've rearranged all of our cities over the past 50 years in the US around a technology. And the problem is that when you build for a technology, if that technology can't be afforded by everybody, if the infrastructure can't be maintained, your city is going to fail. And that's the thing, is it's just a advancement. It's like a version, it's 2.0 of the same technology that we still can't afford, right? So nobody's talking. We're like, okay, maybe it'll make cars more accessible. We won't have to own. We'll have car share, and the Ubers and Lyfts will all be driverless and whatnot. But that still doesn't answer the question of the infrastructure. We still have infrastructure that's failing. I talked about 345. It's been structurally failing since 2000. So it comes back to that. How do we actually afford all of that infrastructure? And to me, it's like, yep, driverless cars could be great, but how do we actually build a city so it's not just about driverless cars, but it's about choice and other ways of getting around?
All right, Sarah, you're next.
So I actually have two questions, and the first one kind of ties off of Ricky's. So with technology, I was watching a TikTok the other day with Elon Musk, and in LA he was talking about this idea to essentially build kind of like the German Autobahn underneath LA. So adding more highways essentially inside the city. So how do you see that? I mean, obviously that's not something that's happening,
Right. He got a lot of blowback for that too, because he basically came up with the idea because he was stuck in traffic in his tunnel. Is how does he get from his house to where he works? He's like, okay, who are we really building that city for then, or that piece of infrastructure for then? The other part of it is, okay, how do we pay for it? He's saying he can tunnel cheaper than how we currently tunnel, which I think that would be great because we want to build a second Dart line. It's going to be underground, and we need to figure out how to save costs. And everything in infrastructure is incredibly expensive, especially here in this country, for reasons nobody can quite figure out why. So if he can figure out how to build a tunnel cheaper, that would be great, right? The question is it just for cars? And he's now come off that to say, oh no, we actually want it to be multimodal and whatnot. And okay, fine, but if it's a tunnel for multimodal, it's really only good for trains because you don't want to bike in a tunnel, do you? And unless it's all emissions-free vehicles. So I don't think it's a good idea to build it, just another highway down below. He thought it was at the time, and that's probably why he's gotten so much blowback. But at the end of the day, if it was just a tunnel, imagine what happens at the end of both ends of those tunnels, right? It's just cars come spewing out, and what does it do to the end of that? Like, which tunnel is it? And it goes into Manhattan, but as soon as it comes out, it's like everything around there is awful. Right? So what's the impact, not just of the movement between, what's the impact of the end of that too, that we have to think about. So yeah, I mean, if you can figure out a way to bore cheaply, great. But yeah, we shouldn't have, I think we shouldn't have single use thinking, right? That linear thinking working in cities, and that's the problem that we've had, is that cities have multiple purposes. It's not just how do we move a car or whatnot. Cities really take lateral thinking, not just linear thinking.
I've been seeing a ton of like new apartment buildings and townhouses just popping up, like it seems overnight. And I guess just as living there, I feel like a lot of it is driven by the developments in Lower Greenville and Deep Ellum, but it doesn't really seem like there's really all that much space left for any actual like commercial use there. So you were talking about like if that comes down, where is the space for that development?
Under it, because it's a huge piece of infrastructure. It's actually like 4 highways in one. And so I think when we looked at 245 acres, that was obviously including a lot of the private land around it, because we would be repositioning that. And yes, it has started to infill to somewhat, but at the end of the day, there's still like 60 some acres that would be publicly owned currently that's under the right of way now, and we'd still be able to reposition that. And frankly, a lot of the development that's happening is it's just adding supply. There's no sort of placemaking component to it, and we'd be able to also deliver the parks, the green spaces, the plazas that are centerpieces for all that new development as well. So there's it's more than just delivering housing supply, which seems to be a lot that's happening down Ross. Just get as many units in as possible, and nobody's actually thinking about the demand side of that equation too. It's like, how do we develop in a way that the property owner across the street from me also wants to do something good as well? It's not just get as many units in before the market cycle ends and the music stops. So I think that's the opportunity there as well.
All right, go ahead, Emma.
So, I'm assuming the idea, this is build it and they will come. In those cities that were designed around cars and were failing and the middle class left, and then they were able to come back, what's the timeline for the middle class to come back?
Could be never.
Ever.
I mean, we don't know. That's the problem, is that we have to work to try to bring them back. And it means we have to deliver a range of housing types. So we have to revisit our codes to allow those kinds of range of housing types as well. So it's not just big apartment buildings or single family homes. We have to do everything in between. And the challenge with that is that it's the same amount of brain damage getting your permits and your zoning and everything to do a couple townhomes or a duplex as it is to do high rise. So what are you going to do? Are you going to do the thing that's going to give you $50 million in profit, or the thing that's going to give you $50,000 in profit if you have to spend 2 years of your life doing it? So how do we have to figure that out, which is part of it. And then of course, one thing that always comes up is schools as well. And so when we talk about Uptown having the fastest growing demographic is 0 to 5, first thing that we said was like, we've got to solve this, because as soon as those kids turn 5, everybody's like, we got to go to Richardson. Like, we don't, and Uptown's goal is like, we don't want to lose those people. We want to continue to diversify in age and income and everything else. And so we said, okay, well, how do we make it more amenable for all ages? And so one thing we did was we organized all those young families, created a Facebook group, and said, once a month, let's have, coffee and play date or whatever, so everybody could meet each other. And again, they're organizing. So then once you've got that group, they can go meet the principals of their feeder pattern, understand their feeder pattern, because a lot of it's about ignorance. There's like, oh, schools are bad, gotta leave, right? So people have to understand that they have agency over the schools as well, and that's something that we've seen in East Dallas. In the 90s, the baby boomer, or not the baby boomers, Gen X was doing the same thing. It's, I like living here. I don't want to leave. I don't want to go out to the suburbs. And they start changing their schools. Now it's happening in North Oak Cliff. So people actually have agency, can change that. They just have to know it. And so now those groups are meeting their principals. We've been talking with DISD. DISD is starting to change programs to be more attractive to basically have magnet-ish things in all their schools, so they're not losing, because they have the same problem everywhere, not just in some of these areas. So schools is a big part of it, but we know it's like, hey, we can change that too. Plus DISD also has some of the best schools in the entire country. You just have to know how to get into them. So that's a solvable problem too. So it's range of housing types, it's improving livability, it's making sure we have a range of affordability, it's improving schools, and you know, it's one of these things where it's like we all have to push forward in all of our neighborhoods in all of these different ways to make sure that the city is as livable as possible.
Who else?
A question on the phone.
Question on the phone,
Question on
from
the phone,
above.
All right. I was wondering if there's some kind of vision or support on a higher level from state or federal government to support efforts like this, or if it's something that individual cities are just having to tackle on their own.
Cities are on their own, unfortunately. And that's our biggest problem. That's what all Texas cities are dealing with, that the state legislature is actively hostile to cities. And that means either starving them of money or not caring, or just putting all state money to highways. That's currently where we're at. And you know, I'm going to be in Austin next week at the Senate building on a panel talking about the future of mobility and transportation. And everybody else in the panel is like, we need more money. I said, we've got plenty of money. We just need to invest it wisely. And that's going to be my take on that panel. But yeah, it's not good. And you know, I think what we've seen is that people need to vote and they need to be active, because we've got one of the lowest voter turnouts, both in the city and state elections. And you have to make sure that your values when it comes to infrastructure in cities and your neighborhoods are actually met by the people that you're voting for. So it's a tough one. It's one that we're running into all the time.
Okay, Ruth?
So the progression you showed with the, like, I don't know if Bishop Arts went through that progression or, yeah, you were flipping to get to that one. Is that a proven progression, or is it one just you've seen pieces of it work and that's what you put together and you're thinking, I think this will do it?
That's a good question. It's something where it's like, we know that all of these things were required. There wasn't any one magic bullet, and I've taken this model to a council person. That council person immediately just went to the end. It was like, oh, how do I just clear out all the business? It's like, that's the wrong thing. We have to cultivate this, right? It's a lot of different things that we have to do. You need somebody working on the ground day to day. That it's like, yeah, these are some of the things. It's also going to take a lot of other things as well that we don't quite know. So it takes somebody that's basically embedded in the neighborhood that can adapt. Say, you know what, this one thing's not working quite right. How do we recalibrate that, or how do we rework it? So every place is ultimately different, as long as we get rid of the bad regulations, right? Which tends to be minimum parking requirements, things like that. Things we know are causing problems. Clear those out. And then we could have to calibrate all the other stuff. So it's not like, hey, here's the playbook, you just go do it. So you have to have somebody that understands it and really sort of nurturing that plays back together. And most importantly, you need a lot of people doing it then too. So it's not just that one sort of caretaker. But yeah, I mean, we know those are the things that are bad. Let's get rid of those, and then let's sort of adapt and figure things out, provided you have sort of that end goal in mind. And that end goal shouldn't just be like this pretty picture. It should just be something broader. Like, what do we really want here? How is this become a complete neighborhood where we've got everything we need here? You know, which Bishop Arts, it's like, it's all restaurants. How do we get the other needs there as well? So I think it's really, it's about that bigger idea, just working towards that idea and adapting as need be. Portland has an official policy that all neighborhoods should be complete neighborhoods, which means all of your daily needs are within 20-minute walk. And it's all about how do we make sure we've got all of those kind of amenities and diversity of activities and everything else within that neighborhood, so you don't have to get in a car and drive. But no, there's not one fixed set playbook, but we do know some of the bad things that are there. We do know some good practices. So not every place is going to be the same, but a general direction.
All right, Kelsey and then Sam, and I don't know.
So I'm just personally very curious about this. I live in Uptown, just above the Starbucks that you mentioned, and
Close where?
yeah, and now everyone knows where I live. Don't worry. But I've noticed there's empty commercial property right across the street that's been empty since I moved in there 3 years ago, and other businesses closing on McKinney Avenue in the last 6 months, and they're not quickly being bought or filled by something else. And so I'm just kind of curious why you think that is.
Well, yeah, it's a transitional period in Uptown. As Uptown demographically diversifies, the businesses also have to diversify as well, and that's something that they're they're keen on, and it's all not just late night clubs. And we've probably seen some of that in the news as well, that there's some late night issues. And part of that is that's McKinney, in that particular spot, is one of the worst parts to have people spilling out at 2 in the morning because there's no transit whatsoever. So it's a regional draw. It's mostly not locals. And then those people have to get in the cars or Ubers or whatever and drive. So it's not really a good place for that. And so part of it is also real estate dynamics. That land is so valuable. The question is, does a deal work? Can people pull together the financing? So a lot of things are closing because somebody's about to do a tower, or then that deal falls through. So we've seen that with Idle Rich. Like, they closed because it was about to be a tower, then that deal fell through, and now it's going to be another Irish pub. So there's a lot of that happening, and a lot of it's just transitional use and trying to figure out what's going on there. A lot of people are just sort of waiting until they become a high rise comes towards them. So it's not an issue of demand, which is a good thing. It means the place is healthy. It's just, timeline of neighborhoods and cities is longer than our day-to-day lives. Things change generationally, not week to week, year to year. But yeah, that's something we're working on in Uptown, is making sure that there's that same kind of variety of day and night destinations. It's not just nighttime destinations.
All right, I think Sam has a question.
Hey, I would like to hear your opinion on what you think about the Trinity River Park project. There's a lot of pessimism out there about it. I think the word boondoggle.
But the park and not the highway. We're assuming the highway is dead, right?
Yeah, that was the second part of my question. Were you part of any of that conversation?
Well, yeah. I tried to stay out of it as much as possible. And then Raphael Anchia, who's a state rep, said, hey, can you come debate Michael Morris, the transportation czar of the region? I was like, okay, if the state rep asks you, you got to do that. So the funny thing was that I started researching because I was trying to stay out of it because it was so politically messy. But I also tried to stay out of DISD stuff. Well, what I found was that the area along the river has like 113,000 or 117,000 jobs, and it only has a handful of people actually living there. And it's like, okay, why are we trying to get people to drive from here up to here? Should we actually rearrange that, right? How do we get jobs closer to housing and housing closer to jobs? And if we've got an amenity there, say it's a park, not a highway, there's actually a reason to start repositioning all that real estate to be neighborhoods, right? Because if you've got 100,000 jobs in the medical district and Love Field, we've got all this low intensity warehouse logistics stuff, sort of the original inland port. Why don't we ship all that stuff that shouldn't be in the center of the city, in the most congested part of the city, ship all that stuff out to I-20, jobs closer to housing down here. Then we're able to reposition all this real estate to be housing. So it's closer to jobs, so we're not just trying to build to drive, we're actually leveraging the private sector to solve our transportation problems for us. Now the problem with that, with the toll road too, was that nobody could finance it, right? It didn't make sense. It wasn't going to generate the tolls that they needed to build it, and that's part of the bigger issue that we're dealing with statewide on tolls, that forever it's a terrible financing mechanism, but it's a really good congestion mitigation. It encourages people not to drive. So it's like, okay, you need people to drive to spend money on the toll to finance the thing. This is a terrible financial model. So assuming that thing is dead, because nobody actually wants to build it, yeah, I hope it becomes a park. I hope it's useful. I think they have, they've got $50 million, a gift. But they've got to deliver on that. I think they have good ideas. They want the park to actually reach out beyond the levees, because the levees, of course, are a barrier as well. So if the park also extends into the neighborhoods, I think that'll be good for all the surrounding areas. So it's not like, oh, I have to go into the middle of the park, or I have to drive down into it to park. You can actually live nearby and actually use it without having to go in it. So I think all that's smart, but I don't know. They're going to need more than $50 million to do it. And there's some people say, well, you don't need $50 million, just improve the trails and whatnot, and that's that. So to me, it's not really my most important fight. But at the end of the day, it's an amenity now. It'll be an amenity in the future. If people want to put more money to it, great.
All right, maybe one or two more questions. I know, Aaron, you had one.
So, Chelsea actually already asked my first question, but my second question is that I know some of us live in the West Village area in Uptown, and I've read that Central Market owns that grocery store on McKinney, And I just
the old
wondered,
Albertsons.
yeah, and so.
It's a group out of Florida.
Hmm?
It's a group out of Florida that
Yes.
owns it.
Oh, okay. But
But yeah, it will be a grocery store.
okay, so I was
I've seen
wondering.
the plans and they're confidential.
Okay.
Are you saying you want to know what's going to happen there?
Well, I was curious because that region, like I guess we've got the Kroger's across 75, but even that, it's not a very, like, you don't want to walk that. I live a 7-minute walk away, but I don't want to walk it.
Right.
And so I guess I was wondering, like, is there anything that the city can do to kind of say, like, hey, y'all need to actually build something here rather than just sit on it?
Well, yeah, it's about to be another grocery store. It's going to. I think it's going to be a very large single market. Like larger than their usual one. Then there's also going to be office and residential on top of it. So it's going to be high rise. We met with them because Lemon Avenue was a problem. Living in West Village, I'm sure you're like, I don't want to be on Lemon. And so we're trying to figure out how we can fix Lemon and calm it, because right now it's a barrier. They realize it's like we're stuck in between it because we've got Lemon one way on both sides. So we're trying to figure out ways we can calm that and redesign that. It's just a challenge because the couplet is moving 60,000 cars per day, and it was a 3-year effort to get Kinney Avenue through the thoroughfare plan amendment, which is sort of like the zoning case for a street. And you have to have the whole public process, and people will come out and be like, "I use that road every day. It's cut through traffic." And we sort of have to deal with it, but it doesn't mean it has to exist in its current format. That's hostile and unsafe. So we're working on it. All these things take time.
But does the city have the right to say, hey, y'all need to do something with this property, or if someone
They
wants
have
to
the
buy
right
it
to
and
zone
hold
it.
it and do nothing?
They have the right to zone it the way they want, but that's really not the tradition in Dallas, that people basically just customize their own zoning and they can do whatever they want. But the land is worth so much that most people will do the right thing. And so they're coming in and they're like, you know what, we're going to do a grocery store, we're going to do mixed use developments, and it'll be great. On the other hand, people don't have to, what I would say, act in their own best interests, which is right across the street. There's that awful CDS, and everybody hates it because, one, they were required to build out in the street, so they put their back ends out to the sidewalk and face the parking lot. On the other hand, they also didn't maximize the value. It's just a single-story CDS, and they didn't care. So it's like one of those things where what can you do? Because in Dallas, the zoning doesn't have a whole lot of power, and that's just sort of the way it is, and we have to deal with that. And that's why a lot of my talks like this is also going to the real estate community and saying, you know what, have you thought about this? Like, how do you maximize your own value and figure out the financing or your own business model, so it's not just about short-term returns, but also long-term returns. But the thing is, 10 years ago, the real estate community wasn't talking about walkability or any of this stuff, and now I was at a real estate panel, and every single developer was like, we got to improve the public realm, and we got to widen the sidewalks. It was like, whoa, everything has changed. There's been a sea change in the real estate community that I think is interesting, that the developers are actually ahead of the city on a lot of this stuff too. So I wouldn't expect the city to provide much help. You got to really hope that a developer acts in enlightened self-interest. But in that particular case, provided the market doesn't crash in the next 18 months, you'll have a nice development with a big grocery store.
All right, one final question, Katie.
Okay. So I've always wondered this: when you drive south on 45, South Dallas, I feel like that area as well, kind of similarly to how you were talking about the Trinity Groves area, how there's it's really close to downtown, but yet it's not exactly super, I guess, there's not a ton of people living there. Similarly on 45, every time I drive south, I'm like, man, why, you go north and it just goes north for forever, but when you go south, I mean, that Ennis, of course. Kyle lives in Ennis. But, what's the, I guess, reasoning that I feel like that area just isn't as populated?
It's depopulated. Yeah. So South Dallas once had 70,000 people. It's now got about 20,000 people, And so not only has everything gone to the north, but there's been a lot of growth to the south, and it's been a lot of people saying, you know what, I'm fed up with this. Either they were displaced by all the highways that were built in, or they were frustrated by their elected leadership. And we can, corruption issues is a whole different thing. But then people, the middle class basically left. And they said, the people with means were like, you know what, let's go down to DeSoto or Duncanville or wherever, and we're going to basically start our own communities, and that's fine. Problem is, everybody that's still there couldn't leave, and they couldn't afford to leave. Now the median incomes in that area are between like 12 and 18,000, and the area legitimately looks like Detroit. The land is worth like $1 for an acre, but that's not much different than what Uptown was in 1990 either. And so it gets back to that question of how do we revitalize, how do we reinvest, but without displacement, so people can also benefit from that growth. A lot of people politically are like, well, if we just bury 30, that'll magically bridge the divide. And that's when I met with Wick Allison from D Magazine, said that's not the answer, Wick. We actually have to get rid of 345 because 75 was built, 30 years ago, and it's taken till now for the development to jump across Uptown to the east side. Because that doesn't solve the deeper problem. It's just putting it below ground. It's not really, investment's not going to magically jump over there because investment's inherently conservative. It follows other profitable investment. And that's when I said, if we get rid of 345, we can actually steer that investment around, and then eventually we can get down to South Dallas. So that's part of it. Fair Park is going to be part of it too. And how do we leverage that public asset? Right now, it's all parking lots and ring roads. It's like that's not a place you want to spend time. It's fenced off. So I'm on a team that's actually bidding to manage Fair Park. And the first thing we did is tear down all the fences, rebuild roads through it, so it's more like Balboa Park in San Diego, and where there's, instead of parking lots, it's actually useful activity space at the edge too. So you're right. It's been disinvested. It's been depopulated. To me, just like Uptown, people saw it as an opportunity. They said, somebody read Jane Jacobs and said, you know what? There's no place to work near, or no place to live near where I work. And so I want to do that. They had to go to Japan to get the financing at the time because nobody knew what to do. So it's an opportunity, and we just have to manage it well so it's not displacement, but it's also about revitalization.
All right, well, thank you very much. I want to give you a little something. Thank you, Patrick, for coming. This was our inaugural session of the Sendero Speaker Series, so you were the first.
Excellent.
I'm sure there were some glitches here, but I think it went very well, and I was
It was
thrilled
fun.
to have you here. So thank you for coming. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.